"Mom, I already signed the discharge papers. You'll be fine for a few hours," my daughter said before walking out of the emergency room and blocking my number before sunrise. I didn't understand what was happening at first. At 68 years old, after surviving 41 years of marriage, burying my husband during the coldest winter Maine had seen in a decade, and learning how to live alone in a house that suddenly sounded too quiet at night, I thought I understood loneliness. But nothing prepared me for waking up in a hospital chair at 4 o'clock in the morning and realizing my own daughter had disappeared without telling me where she went. Outside the emergency room windows, snow drifted sideways through the parking lot under the yellow glow of streetlights. The storm had started sometime after midnight, covering the town in a heavy layer of white that made everything look distant and unreal. A nurse with tired eyes approached me holding a clipboard against her chest. "Ma'am, did your daughter say where you'd be staying after discharge?" she asked gently. I stared at her for a moment, confused by the question. "At home," I answered slowly. "I live alone." The nurse hesitated. I noticed the way her expression shifted, polite concern replacing routine professionalism. "Your daughter mentioned you might need assistance at home," she said carefully. She also asked whether the doctor planned to recommend observation for confusion. Confusion. The word landed harder than it should have. I sat up straighter in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. "I'm not confused," I said quietly. "I had chest pain. That's why she brought me here." The nurse nodded quickly, almost apologetically. "Of course. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." Safe. That word stayed with me long after she walked away. Melissa had insisted on driving me to St. Mary's Hospital herself after I nearly fainted in my kitchen earlier that evening. She'd acted worried then. Attentive. She even held my arm walking through the sliding ER doors while snow blew against our coats. But now my phone screen showed the same message every time I called her. User. Unavailable. I tried texting. Nothing delivered. I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe her battery died. Maybe she drove home through the storm and lost service somewhere along Route 1. But deep down, another feeling was beginning to spread slowly through my chest, colder than the Maine winter outside. Fear. Not fear of being alone. I'd been alone since Richard died 18 months earlier. This felt different. This felt deliberate. Around 5:30 in the morning, a young doctor finally returned with my paperwork and told me the tests looked stable. Mild exhaustion, elevated blood pressure, stress. He recommended rest and follow-up appointments. Normal things for a widow nearing 70. As I gathered my coat and purse, I noticed something strange immediately. The small leather folder where I kept my insurance papers and copies of my trust documents was missing from my bag. I froze beside the discharge desk, searching again more carefully this time, my fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't there. I remembered Melissa holding that folder earlier in the night while I answered questions at intake. I remembered her saying, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Standing there under the harsh fluorescent lights with snow piling outside and my daughter nowhere to be found, I suddenly realized something that made my stomach tighten with dread. Melissa hadn't forgotten me at the ER. She had left me there on purpose. The taxi driver kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror as we drove along the icy roads toward my house on the edge of Bar Harbor. I could tell he was worried about leaving an older woman alone after a night in the emergency room during a snowstorm, but I assured him 3 separate times that I would be fine. The truth was, I was no longer certain of that myself. Snow covered the front steps when I finally reached home just after 7 in the morning. The Atlantic wind coming off the water cut through my wool coat as I unlocked the front door with stiff fingers. Usually, stepping inside brought me comfort. Richard and I had spent 32 years turning that old cedar-shingled house into something warm and steady. But that morning, the silence felt wrong, heavy somehow, like the house had been holding its breath while I was gone. I locked the door behind me and stood in the foyer for a long moment without taking off my coat. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly through the quiet. Richard used to wind it every Sunday evening after dinner. Even now, 18 months after his death, I could still picture him standing there in his plaid flannel shirt adjusting the brass pendulum with careful hands. Some mornings I still expected to hear his coffee mug set down in the kitchen or his footsteps crossing the hallway upstairs. Grief did not leave all at once. It faded in strange pieces. A voice forgotten here. A habit remembered there. I carried my purse into the kitchen and immediately noticed something strange. One of the cabinet drawers beside the refrigerator was slightly open. I frowned and pushed it shut automatically before realizing I never left drawers open. Richard used to tease me about that. "Evelyn Harper," he would laugh. "You could run a military base with how organized you are." I forced myself to breathe slowly. Maybe Melissa had opened it while looking for tea bags before driving me to the hospital. That would make sense. I set my purse on the counter and reached for my phone again. Still blocked. My chest tightened. I opened the refrigerator and stared blankly at the leftovers from the soup I made earlier that week. Suddenly, I was too tired to think about food. The storm outside rattled lightly against the kitchen windows while the furnace hummed through the house. I walked upstairs intending to change clothes and sleep for a few hours, but halfway down the hallway I stopped cold. The door to Richard's old study was cracked open. I always kept that door closed. Always. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside slowly. At first, everything appeared normal. The dark mahogany shelves. The framed photographs from our trips along the Maine coast. The faded leather chair beside the window where Richard spent winter evenings reading historical biographies. Then I noticed the filing cabinet near the desk. The bottom drawer was not fully shut. My stomach dropped. I moved closer and pulled it open carefully. The folders inside had been disturbed. The labels were no longer in order. Trust documents, property taxes, insurance records, investment statements. Richard's handwriting still marked several of the tabs in neat blue ink. I crouched beside the cabinet, suddenly aware of how loud the wind sounded outside. Someone had gone through these papers. Not quickly either. Carefully. Intentionally. I reached automatically for the small gray lockbox Richard kept hidden behind a row of old accounting binders. My fingers froze the moment I touched it. The combination dial had been reset. I stared at it for several seconds without moving. Richard and I shared that code for more than 20 years. Melissa did not know it. At least I never thought she did. My hands began trembling as I lowered myself slowly into Richard's desk chair. For the first time since leaving the hospital, a terrible possibility started forming clearly in my mind. This was not about concern for my health. This was not about an overwhelmed daughter forgetting to answer her phone during a snowstorm. Something else was happening inside my family. Something planned. Something cold. Then my phone rang suddenly in my hand, making me jump so hard I nearly dropped it. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital. For several seconds, I only stared at the phone vibrating in my hand while snow tapped softly against the study windows. Something inside me already knew that whatever waited on the other end of that call would change everything. I answered slowly. "Hello, Mrs. Harper?" the woman asked gently. "This is Amanda Reed from St. Mary's Hospital. We spoke briefly this morning before discharge." I remembered her immediately. She was the nurse with tired blue eyes and the calm voice that made me feel less invisible sitting alone in that emergency room. "Yes," I answered quietly. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear papers shifting in the background. "I hope you do not mind me calling," she said carefully. "But after reviewing your file this morning, I felt uncomfortable about something." My grip tightened around the phone. Outside, the wind howled sharply off the Atlantic, rattling the old cedar shingles along the roof. "What kind of something?" I asked. Amanda lowered her voice slightly. "Your daughter contacted the hospital again after she left." I felt my stomach tighten instantly. "Melissa called?" "Yes, ma'am. About 40 minutes after she left the emergency room." Another pause. "She wanted to know whether the attending physician planned to recommend cognitive evaluation." I frowned, genuinely confused. Cognitive evaluation? Testing related to memory decline, dementia screening, mental competency concerns. The words seemed unreal sitting there in Richard's study surrounded by 30 years of family photographs and financial records. "That makes no sense," I whispered. "I have never been diagnosed with anything like that." "I know," Amanda said softly. "That is why I am calling." My heartbeat began thudding heavily in my chest. I stood slowly from the desk chair and crossed toward the window overlooking the frozen coastline behind the house. Gray waves rolled violently beneath the snow clouds. "What exactly did my daughter say?" I asked. Amanda hesitated again before answering. "She told the intake coordinator you had become increasingly forgetful since your husband passed away. She also asked whether your condition last night could support a recommendation for assisted living supervision." The room suddenly felt colder than before. I stared out toward the ocean without really seeing it. Melissa had been telling people I was unstable. The realization settled over me slowly, like ice spreading across dark water. There is more, Amanda continued carefully. This morning your daughter also requested information about obtaining temporary medical authorization in case you became unable to make decisions independently. I closed my eyes. Richard's face flashed suddenly through my memory. 3 years earlier, shortly before his cancer treatments began, he sat beside me at this very desk one rainy evening and said quietly, "Promise me something, Evie. If anyone ever tries convincing you that you are helpless before you truly are, fight it." At the time I laughed and accused him of being dramatic. Now his words echoed through the study with terrifying clarity. "Mrs. Harper?" Amanda asked gently. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. "I am here. I am sorry if I crossed a line calling you directly," she said. But something about the situation did not feel right to me. I swallowed hard and looked toward the filing cabinet beside Richard's desk. The disturbed folders, the reset lockbox, the missing trust documents. Suddenly, every strange detail from the morning aligned into something much darker than simple family tension. Melissa had not abandoned me at the hospital out of frustration or carelessness. She had left me there hoping doctors would question my mental state, hoping someone would write down words like confused or vulnerable or declining. My knees weakened slightly, and I lowered myself carefully into Richard's chair again. "Amanda," I asked quietly, "did my daughter mention why she believed I needed supervision?" The nurse hesitated one final time. "She said you were struggling to manage your finances after your husband's death." My breath caught. Finances. Not health. Not grief. Finances. I looked slowly around the study Richard once called the heart of our home. The framed deeds. Investment binders. Property records for the house and coastal land. Melissa knew exactly what stood inside these walls. And for the first time in my life, I realized my daughter might not be worried about losing me at all. She might be worried about losing what I owned. After my call with Amanda ended, I sat alone in Richard's study for nearly an hour without moving. The storm outside had softened into a steady snowfall, thick white flakes drifting past the windows in slow silence. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed 10 times, each sound echoing faintly through the house like a reminder that time kept moving whether I was ready or not. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They looked older than I remembered. The veins more visible, the skin thinner. Richard used to hold those hands every morning while drinking coffee at the kitchen table. "These hands built our life," he would say whenever I complained about getting older. I closed my eyes briefly, and memories surfaced one after another with painful clarity. Melissa at 6 years old running barefoot across Sand Beach during summer vacation, laughing while Richard chased her with a towel after she jumped too early into freezing Atlantic water. Melissa at 12 sitting on the front porch wrapped in a blanket after her first heartbreak, crying into my shoulder while I stroked her hair for nearly an hour. Melissa at 23 dancing with her father at her wedding reception beneath strings of white lights, while everyone in the room watched them smiling through tears. For most of her life, my daughter had been warm-hearted and fiercely protective of family. Even after she married Brian Carter 15 years earlier, I tried convincing myself she was still the same person underneath the expensive handbags, polished smiles, and carefully rehearsed conversations about investment properties and tax strategies. But sitting there inside Richard's study, I began replaying moments I had ignored for years. Moments that suddenly looked very different now. 3 summers ago, shortly before Richard became seriously ill, Brian stood in this very room admiring the ocean view from the study windows. He whistled softly and said, "Property like this has to be worth at least $3 million by now." I remembered how uncomfortable the comment made Richard. Later that evening, after guests left, my husband quietly poured himself another cup of coffee and stared out toward the coastline for a long time before speaking. "Brian looks at this house like a business deal," he said quietly, "not a home." At the time, I defended Melissa immediately. I told Richard he was being unfair, that younger generations simply talked differently about money. But over the following years, strange little comments kept appearing like cracks spreading slowly across glass. Melissa encouraging us to simplify our estate planning. Brian asking detailed questions about property taxes and trust structures during Thanksgiving dinner. Casual suggestions about selling the coastal land because older people do not need that much space. I remembered one Christmas Eve when, Richard suddenly grew unusually quiet after Melissa and Brian left for the night. He sat beside the fireplace, holding a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. "Promise me something," he said softly without looking at me. "If anything ever happens to me, do not let anyone rush you into decisions." I laughed at him then. Told him he sounded paranoid. Richard simply nodded and stared into the fire. I understood now that he had seen things long before I did. My chest tightened painfully at the realization. Grief had blinded me after his death. I was so exhausted from learning how to exist without him that I missed the slow shift happening around me. Melissa started managing more conversations, more paperwork, more decisions. At first it felt comforting having my daughter nearby, after 41 years of marriage ended with a funeral and a cemetery overlooking frozen ground. But comfort can become dependence without you noticing. I stood slowly and walked toward the study bookshelf where Richard kept family photo albums. My fingers brushed lightly across the spines until I found the navy leather album from Melissa's wedding. I opened it carefully. There she was smiling beside Brian outside the old church in Portland. Young, beautiful, hopeful. Richard stood beside them with his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. Looking at that photograph hurt more than I expected, because somewhere between that moment and the emergency room, my daughter had stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as an obstacle standing between her and something she wanted. Then my eyes drifted toward the filing cabinet again, and for the first time in my life, I asked myself a question that felt almost impossible to say out loud. How long had Melissa been planning this? The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the coastline buried beneath nearly 14 inches of snow. The world outside my kitchen windows looked deceptively peaceful. Pine branches sagged under thick white layers, and the ocean beyond the cliffs rolled quietly beneath pale gray skies. Normally mornings like that made me feel grateful to live in Maine. Richard used to call snowfall along the coast nature, teaching people to slow down. But that morning, every shadow inside the house felt heavier than before. I barely slept the night before. Every creak in the hallway made me wonder whether someone had entered the house while I was gone at the hospital. Every memory I replayed led back to the same terrifying possibility. Melissa was trying to convince people I could no longer manage my own life. I sat at the kitchen table holding a cup of coffee gone cold while staring at my phone. Still blocked. No messages. No explanations. Just silence. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the landline rang suddenly beside me, making me jump. Almost nobody called the house phone anymore. I picked it up cautiously. "Evelyn," a familiar voice asked. "This is Walter Jennings." Relief hit me so quickly it nearly made me dizzy. Walter had been Richard's attorney and closest friend for more than 25 years. He handled our estate planning, business filings, and every major legal decision we ever made. Richard trusted him completely. "Walter," I whispered, "I am glad you called." There was an immediate pause on the line. "You sound exhausted," he said gently. "Are you all right?" For a moment, I almost lied out of habit. Women my age spent decades pretending everything was fine for the sake of family harmony. But something inside me had shifted since the emergency room. "No," I admitted quietly. "I do not think I am." Silence settled briefly between us before Walter spoke again. "Melissa contacted my office yesterday afternoon." My fingers tightened around the phone. "About what?" "She requested copies of your current trust structure and power of attorney documents." My heart began pounding instantly. "Did you give them to her?" "Absolutely not." His tone hardened in a way I rarely heard. "Evelyn, I need you to answer something honestly. Has your daughter been pressuring you about assisted living or financial control?" I looked slowly around the kitchen Richard once filled with music every Sunday morning while cooking blueberry pancakes. Suddenly, I remembered little things I ignored before. Melissa casually mentioning retirement communities near Portland. Brian joking that maintaining a coastal property was too much responsibility for someone nearing 70. The way Melissa once insisted on reviewing my monthly expenses to help organize things. At the time, it all sounded practical, caring. Now it sounded calculated. "Walter," I asked quietly, "what happens if someone convinces a court that I cannot manage my own affairs?" He exhaled slowly before answering. "Temporary guardianship can be granted during competency review. Financial control may transfer until evaluation is complete." A cold wave moved through my chest. "And my trust?" "Your trust remains protected unless a legal representative gains authority to act on your behalf. I closed my eyes. Everything suddenly connected with terrifying precision. The emergency room. The questions about confusion. The missing documents. Melissa was building a narrative piece by piece. A grieving widow. Forgetful. Vulnerable. Unable to manage complex finances alone. Walter's voice softened again. Richard worried about this possibility before he passed. My eyes opened instantly. What do you mean? There was another pause. 6 months before his death, he adjusted portions of your estate structure. My breath caught. Adjusted how? He added protections requiring independent medical evaluations before any transfer of authority could occur. He specifically instructed me never to release trust control based solely on family testimony. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Even dying, Richard had still been trying to protect me. He knew, I whispered. Walter answered carefully. I think Richard noticed certain conversations that made him uncomfortable. I stared toward the empty chair across the kitchen table where my husband used to sit every morning reading the local newspaper beside his coffee. Suddenly grief mixed with something sharper. Anger. Not loud anger. Not dramatic anger. Something colder. Quieter. The kind that settles deep inside your bones after betrayal finally becomes undeniable. Walter lowered his voice slightly before asking one final question. Evelyn, did your daughter leave you alone at the hospital on purpose? I looked out at the frozen coastline beyond. The windows, and for the first time since Melissa abandoned me at the emergency room, I answered honestly. Yes, I said quietly. I believe she did. Melissa finally called 3 days later while I was standing at the kitchen sink watching gulls circle above the frozen shoreline. Her name lighting up my phone sent a strange feeling through me. Not relief. Not comfort. Something closer to caution. I let the phone ring twice before answering. Mom. Her voice sounded softer than usual, carefully measured. I have been worried sick about you. I stared out the window at the snow-covered deck behind the house. That is interesting, I said quietly. Because your phone blocked mine. Silence. Just long enough to matter. Then a small nervous laugh. Oh my goodness, Mom. I did not block you. My phone has been acting strange all week. The lie came too quickly. Too smoothly. A few days earlier I would have accepted it because mothers spend their lives wanting to believe their children. But now every word felt sharpened around the edges. How are you feeling? She continued. The hospital called me after you left. They said you seemed confused. There it was. Not concern. Not apology for abandoning me in an emergency room during a snowstorm. Confused. I gripped the edge of the sink harder. I remember everything perfectly, I answered calmly, including waking up alone at 4 a.m. Another pause settled between us. I could almost hear her adjusting strategies in real time. Mom, she said gently, lowering her voice into that careful tone people use with frightened children. You have been under enormous stress since Dad passed away. Nobody would blame you for having memory lapses. Memory lapses. The phrase sent cold anger quietly moving through my chest. I see, I said. Melissa, why did you contact the hospital asking about competency evaluations? Complete silence this time. Not surprise. Calculation. When she finally spoke again, her voice had become softer, almost wounded. I was only trying to help you. Brian and I are worried. You nearly collapsed alone in that giant house. What if something worse happens next time? I closed my eyes briefly. There had been a time when hearing concern in my daughter's voice comforted me. Now I heard something else underneath it. Pressure. I have managed this house for 32 years, I answered. I think I can still manage breakfast and blood pressure medication. Melissa sighed heavily, like someone dealing with an unreasonable parent. Mom, this is exactly what I mean. You are becoming defensive over simple conversations. I almost admired how carefully she was building the story. Every disagreement became evidence. Every boundary became instability. Richard had seen it coming long before I did. Maybe we should look at some safer options, Melissa continued carefully. There is a beautiful assisted living community near Portland with ocean views and on-site nursing staff. I glanced slowly around my kitchen. Richard's favorite coffee mug still sat, drying beside the sink. His old winter coat still hung near the mudroom because I had not been ready to move it. This house was not just property. It was my entire life. Melissa knew that. I am not leaving my home, I said quietly. Nobody is forcing you, she replied immediately. But maybe we should also discuss power of attorney just in case another medical emergency happens. There it was again. always circling back to control, to paperwork, to authority. I remembered Walter's warning and suddenly understood something important. Melissa believed I was frightened enough to surrender willingly. She thought grief had made me weak. I let several seconds pass before answering in the softest voice I could manage. "Maybe you are right," I said quietly. The silence on the line changed instantly. Melissa had not expected agreement. "Really?" she asked carefully. "You would consider it?" I lowered myself slowly into the kitchen chair beside the window. "I am tired, sweetheart," I whispered. "Everything has felt overwhelming since your father died." Her tone softened immediately with relief. "That is completely normal, Mom. You do not have to handle everything alone anymore." I stared out toward the frozen Atlantic while snow drifted lightly across the cliffs. For the first time in days, I understood exactly what I needed to do. Melissa believed I was becoming confused, vulnerable, easy to manipulate, so I decided to let her believe it a little longer. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I barely recognized. I moved slower when Melissa visited. I repeated questions occasionally. I pretended to struggle balancing my checkbook while she watched from across the kitchen table with carefully hidden satisfaction in her eyes. Every performance felt humiliating at first, but Walter reminded me constantly that survival sometimes required patience instead of pride. "Let them underestimate you," he told me during one of our private meetings at his office in downtown Bar Harbor. "People reveal their true intentions fastest when they think they have already won." Walter's office overlooked the harbor where fishing boats rocked gently beneath sheets of floating ice. Richard and I had spent countless afternoons there over the years discussing taxes, estate planning, and retirement dreams that suddenly felt very far away now. But this time the atmosphere inside the office felt different, more urgent. Walter spread several folders carefully across his desk while adjusting his reading glasses. "I reviewed your current trust structure again last night," he said quietly. "Your daughter cannot legally gain direct control unless competency concerns are formally established." I nodded slowly. "But she is trying." "Yes," he answered bluntly. "And she is doing it carefully." He slid a printed document toward me. "Melissa contacted 2 assisted living communities near Portland last week requesting financial estimates." My stomach tightened instantly. Without speaking to me first, Walter gave me a grim look. One facility specifically noted she asked about memory care transition policies. Memory care. The phrase settled heavily inside my chest. Melissa was planning far beyond temporary supervision. She was building a future where I no longer controlled my own decisions at all. Outside Walter's window, snow drifted quietly across the harbor while tourists in heavy winter coats hurried along the sidewalks below. Everything looked so ordinary. That was the strange thing about betrayal. It happened quietly, beneath normal conversations and polite smiles. Walter leaned back in his chair. Richard anticipated the possibility of financial pressure after his death. He opened another folder and removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's familiar handwriting. My breath caught instantly. "He left that with me 6 months before he passed away," Walter explained softly. "He instructed me not to give it to you unless I believed someone was attempting to manipulate your legal authority." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Evie, if you are reading this, it means something I feared may already be happening. I know how much you love Melissa, and I pray I was wrong about my concerns. But grief makes good people vulnerable, especially kind people. Do not let guilt convince you to surrender your independence before your time. This house belongs to your life, not anyone else's convenience. Trust yourself. More importantly, trust what you see, not what people tell you to see. Love always, Richard." By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the ink beneath my fingers. Richard had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough to understand the danger waiting after he was gone. Walter allowed me several quiet moments before speaking again. "There is another matter," he said carefully. 3 days ago, Melissa requested copies of your banking authorization records through a third-party financial advisor." I looked up sharply. "Can she do that?" "Not legally without your consent," he answered. "But it confirms she is escalating." Something cold settled fully into place inside me then. Until that moment, part of me still hoped Melissa was simply grieving badly or acting out of fear after seeing me collapse in the kitchen. But grief did not explain secret legal inquiries. Grief did not explain memory care research or missing trust documents. This was strategy. deliberate and patient. I folded Richard's letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. "What do we do now?" I asked quietly. Walter's expression hardened slightly. "We protect everything before they move further." Over the next hour, we updated emergency legal directives, reinforced trust protections, and transferred several property controls into structures requiring independent oversight. Walter also advised me to begin documenting every conversation with Melissa moving forward, especially discussions about competency or finances, he said. People pursuing control often become careless once they feel close to obtaining it. As I stood to leave his office, Walter looked at me with unexpected sadness. "Evelyn," he said softly, "the hardest part of situations like this is accepting that the people we love are sometimes capable of things we never imagined." I stared out toward the frozen harbor again before answering. I accepted that the night my daughter left me alone in the emergency room. Melissa invited me to dinner the following Saturday evening. The invitation itself felt strangely formal, almost rehearsed. "Brian and I just want a peaceful family night," she said over the phone with exaggerated warmth. "We have all been under so much stress lately." I agreed immediately, keeping my voice soft and uncertain exactly the way she expected. By then I had become very good at pretending. The drive to their house in Portland took nearly 3 hours along icy highways lined with frozen pine forests and snow-covered gas stations glowing beneath the darkening winter sky. Richard used to love that drive along the coast. He always insisted on stopping halfway for coffee, no matter how many times we made the trip. As I pulled into Melissa's driveway that evening, I noticed 2 unfamiliar luxury vehicles parked beside Brian's truck. Warm yellow lights spilled from the windows, while soft music drifted faintly through the cold air. The house looked beautiful from the outside. Expensive. Perfect. Melissa opened the front door before I even reached the porch. "Mom," she said brightly, hugging me quickly. "You look tired. Are you feeling all right?" The question sounded caring to anyone listening casually, but I noticed the way her eyes studied my face carefully while she asked it, almost like she was gathering evidence. Inside the dining room, Brian greeted me with polished friendliness while pouring wine for their guests, a middle-aged couple I recognized vaguely from one of Brian's investment events. Everyone acted unusually gentle toward me that night. Too gentle. Brian pulled out my chair at dinner. Melissa insisted I sit closest to the fireplace, where it is warmer. Every gesture carried the same quiet message underneath it. Fragile. Elderly. Declining. I played my role carefully. I asked Brian to repeat a story twice. I pretended to forget where I placed my reading glasses. Once, while reaching for my water glass, I allowed my hand to shake slightly. I caught Melissa and Brian exchanging a quick glance across the table when they thought I was not looking. By dessert, I understood something clearly. This dinner was not about family reconciliation. It was an audience rehearsal. Melissa wanted witnesses who would later describe me as forgetful and vulnerable if necessary. "Mom has had such a difficult year," she said softly while serving blueberry pie onto delicate white plates. "Ever since Dad passed, things have become harder for her to manage alone." The other couple nodded sympathetically. I lowered my eyes slightly and remained silent. "She nearly collapsed recently," Brian added with careful concern. "Honestly, we are starting to think independent living may not be safe anymore." There it was again. Independent living. Every conversation slowly steering toward the same destination. Melissa reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "We only want what is best for you." I looked down at her manicured fingers resting against mine and remembered those same hands gripping mine tightly during elementary school thunderstorms when she was little and afraid of thunder. Strange how love could transform into strategy so quietly you almost missed it happening. "Actually," Brian said casually while cutting another slice of pie, "Melissa and I toured a beautiful memory care community last week. Ocean views. Full medical staff. Really top tier. Memory care." He said it so smoothly, like discussing vacation resorts instead of removing someone's independence piece by piece. I nodded slowly and took a small sip of tea. "That sounds lovely," I answered quietly. Relief flashed across Melissa's face before disappearing almost instantly. She thought I was surrendering. The conversation moved on after that, but I noticed something important. Once they believed I was cooperating, they became careless. Brian joked openly about how difficult large properties were for older widows. Melissa mentioned how exhausting financial paperwork could become for someone grieving and confused. Every word settled carefully into the small digital recorder hidden silently inside my purse beneath a packet of tissues. Walter insisted I carry it everywhere now. People reveal themselves when they feel safe, he told me. By the end of dinner, Melissa looked almost radiant with confidence. As guests prepared to leave, she wrapped an arm around my shoulders and smiled warmly. I think we are finally making progress, she whispered. I smiled back gently. I think so too. But as I drove home through the frozen darkness later that night, Richard's letter rested folded carefully inside my coat pocket. And for the first time since all of this began, I no longer felt afraid. Because while Melissa spent weeks building a case against me, Walter and I had already spent weeks building something far more dangerous against her. 3 weeks later, Melissa invited me back to Portland for what she called an important family discussion. By then, the snow along the Maine coastline had started melting into gray slush along the roadsides, and cold rain tapped steadily against my windshield during the drive south. I already knew what the meeting was really about. Walter had warned me 2 days earlier that Melissa officially contacted a legal consultant regarding temporary guardianship procedures. She thought she was close now, close enough to stop pretending completely. The dinner took place at the same polished dining room table where Brian once bragged about investment properties while Richard quietly watched him with distrust. This time there were no outside guests. Only Melissa, Brian, Walter, and me. Melissa looked nervous when Walter arrived beside me carrying a slim leather briefcase. I thought this was just family, she said carefully. Walter smiled politely. While removing his coat, Richard considered me family for 25 years. Nobody spoke for several uncomfortable seconds after that. Rain streaked slowly across the windows while the grandfather clock in their hallway ticked loudly through the silence. Finally, Brian cleared his throat and folded his hands neatly on the table. Evelyn, he began in that practiced business tone he used whenever trying to sound compassionate. Melissa and I have spent weeks worrying about your health and safety. I nodded slowly without speaking. Melissa leaned forward next. Mom, we love you. But after the hospital incident and several concerning conversations lately, we think it may be time to consider more structured support. Structured support. Such polite words for taking control away from someone. Walter remained completely silent beside me while Melissa continued carefully building her speech. Nobody is trying to upset you, she said softly. But forgetting important things, struggling with finances, and living alone on isolated property at your age can become dangerous. I noticed she no longer sounded emotional, only confident, like someone already rehearsing future testimony. Brian slid several papers slowly across the table toward me. These are temporary guardianship recommendations, he explained smoothly, just until everything stabilizes. I looked down at the documents without touching them. My own daughter had officially prepared paperwork declaring me incapable of managing my life. Strange how betrayal stopped feeling shocking after enough small wounds piled together. Eventually, it simply felt exhausting. Melissa reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. Mom, she whispered, you do not have to fight us anymore. Fight us. As if protecting my own independence was aggression instead of survival. I lifted my eyes slowly toward Walter. He gave the smallest nod. That was all I needed. Carefully, I reached into my purse and removed the small digital recorder Walter asked me to carry over the past month. Melissa's expression shifted instantly. Confusion first, then uncertainty. I placed the recorder calmly in the center of the table and pressed play. Brian's voice filled the dining room almost immediately. Honestly, we are starting to think independent living may not be safe anymore. Then Melissa's voice followed softly. Ever since Dad passed, things have become harder for her to manage alone. The recording continued. Every conversation, every calculated suggestion about memory care facilities, financial authority, and competency concerns. Every carefully crafted statement spoken while they believed I was too weak to notice. The color drained slowly from Melissa's face while Brian sat frozen beside her. Nobody interrupted the recording. Nobody denied anything. When it finally ended, the silence inside that dining room felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering outside. Walter opened his briefcase calmly and slid several documents across the table. Before this meeting, he said evenly, Mrs. Harper updated all trust protections, financial structures, and medical directives. Melissa stared at him blankly. Walter continued. Any future attempts to pursue guardianship without verified independent medical evidence will trigger formal legal review. Brian's jaw tightened visibly. You manipulated us, he said coldly. I almost laughed hearing that word from him. Instead, I folded my hands quietly in my lap. No, I answered softly. I finally paid attention. Melissa's eyes filled suddenly with tears. Real tears this time. Mom, please, she whispered. We were only trying to help. I looked at my daughter carefully for a long moment. I remembered the little girl who once fell asleep on my shoulder during long winter drives home from Portland. I remembered birthday cakes, school plays, summer vacations, and every fever I stayed awake through while holding cold washcloths against her forehead. Loving someone for 41 years does not disappear just because they betray you. That was the cruelest part. You left me alone in an emergency room during a snowstorm, I said quietly. Then you tried convincing people I was losing my mind. Melissa lowered her eyes immediately. Outside, rain continued sliding slowly down the windows while darkness settled across the Maine coastline. Walter gathered the signed documents back into his briefcase and stood beside me. I rose carefully from the table, smoothing the sleeves of my coat before turning toward the door. Behind me, Melissa finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, are you cutting us out completely? I paused for only a second before answering honestly. No, I said quietly. You already did that yourselves the night you decided I was worth more to you, powerless than loved.